Hello, welcome to Furious Driving, and there goes my Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor with Ian from Hubnut. And this is the much anticipated walk around and drive at last of Betty, the Ford Fairmont AU. Ta-da! Here is Betty, Ugly Betty, which is where the name came from, because it's quirkily styled, which is the first thing people will probably talk about if they talk about one of these cars at all, which is not that often in this country because they are not very well known this side of, well, the equator, frankly. But what is it? What is a Ford Fairmont? I will tell you. The Ford Fairmont is a trim level of the Ford Falcon. In this case, the 6th generation Falcon, which ran from 1998 until 2002. And this is a 2001 example. Ian, I'm sure you will know if you watch Hubnut, or indeed the last video just showing this car, bought this car first of all in New Zealand, drove it for a few months during his epic trip around the country, and then had it shipped over to the UK unexpectedly and unplanned almost a little while later, and now it's here. And it shares an awful lot in common with my Ford Crown Victoria, which is, as I say, currently driving in right now. It is rear-wheel drive, ridiculously big engine. It's kind of a bit outdated already when it was built, but they are rather lovable in their own silly way. Let's take a look around. Now, I say this car shares a lot of similarities with the Crown Victoria. In fact, it very nearly was the Crown Victoria, just with slight localisation changes to it. But no, that's not how Australia works. Project Eagle began back in 1993, looking at a replacement for the 5th generation of the Falcon series. They considered a number of Ford global options they could bring over. There was the Taurus from America, but that's front-wheel drive. There was a survey around the turn of the century that showed something like 80% of Australian cars all had tow bars on them, and they felt that rear-wheel drive was better for towing, so that was ruled out. They considered the European Ford Scorpio, the big Granada, but that really just wasn't tough enough because the Australian roads are, well, in a lot of cases they aren't even roads, so you need built tough. They also looked at the Crown Victoria because that is built as tough as they come. But there's a very strong independent streak in the Australian psyche, and a non-Australian product being sold as the flagship Australian product, that really wasn't going to fly. They even considered the Mazda 929 because Mazda was part of the Ford conglomerate at the time. Again, that was ruled out. So by 1998, they decided that no, it had to be Australian designed, Australian built. Which is great because, yeah, it's nice to have these weird evolutionary tracks that go off on their own, like the Holdens. In this case, though, Ford in America had dictated everything had to go into the new edge design, which is showing us really quite interesting and exciting cars in Europe. Things like the KA, the Puma, the Mark I Focus, the Mondeo. All these cars really did look really sharp and modern and exciting. They were just changing the roadscape around us. In Australia, they had to put it on something that was about a metre longer, half a tonne heavier, and a lot more primitive. So they did their very best, and you can see how it worked. A guy called Steve Park was responsible for it, or deserves the blame, depending on which way you want to take it. I think he didn't do a bad job, to be honest, considering the parameters he had to work within and what he had to work with. It wasn't massively well received, and the Holden Commodore of the time was far more traditional looking, and it is quite a traditional market as well, and so that did outsell it. However, the people who bought them loved them because they're just so tough and so well engineered. You may be wondering why I keep flipping between the names Falcon and Fairmont, and that's because Fairmont is basically a trim level on the Falcon range. It goes Forte, which is base, Fairmont, which is kind of middle and a bit posher, Fairmont Gear, which is posher still and gets a few more niceties under the skin, and then you get a couple of performance ones which were quite silly really. And the way you can tell you're being followed by a Fairmont is this bit of chrome on the front of the car, which makes it posh. That's how posh works, chrome. The Fairmont's design was very cutting edge of the moment, and it looked suddenly modern when it came out. The Crown Vic never looked modern, so it hasn't dated in quite the same way as this. Now, walking to the back of the car, it is quite a long walk. You can see more of this new edge styling with the sculpting of the doors, the shape of the wheel patterns, even the little small mirrors. You get down the back and it's quite a traditional shape in the middle, but these lozengey back doors are very Ford new edge really. But people did have a bit of a beef with the size of the rear window in relation to the size of the rear end, and it somehow doesn't always look quite in proportion, but it's got its own, as I say, sharp looks. These are very Mark III Mondeo, these taillights, and the addition of the impressive T-shelf spoiler on the back of this thing, 10 out of 10 for exterior T-shelfery, does actually enhance the look, because the way that this comes to a tapering point just there, and there, mirrors perfectly, and then it's flipped and mirrored in the top of the bumper, so the whole thing, it works. It's got a nice bit of design cohesion. Then we have this big chrome Fairmont badge on the back of it. Fairmont, not Fairmount. If it was a Fairmount, it'd be a 1970s Japanese car. And as you'll notice down here, there is, as predicted, a tow bar. Now the boot is pretty huge, but Ian has stopped off on holiday today, and so it's absolutely crammed with his family's junk, so I won't open the boot and show you, but needless to say, it's pretty sizable. Now let's take a look inside the car. Now, opening up and climbing aboard, you'll notice it is almost recognisably European as you look across the dashboard and the doors. The fabric on the seats and the door cards is so 1990s, this kind of wavery geometric diamond with splatters of colour. It could not get more 1990s than that. The shape of the door pull is so Ford Europe. But then you have these big buttons for the windows, which are very American in their styling, interestingly. And for the first time on a Ford from the last 20 years, or 20 years ago, we haven't got the parts bin Mondeo mirror adjuster. This is always what you find in all of them. That is something you'll find across the entire interior of the car climbing aboard. It does have that strong vibe of European look and feel, but no parts bin parts. Everything is its own thing. So we have got, well, New Age design dictated, a very ovoid shape, lots of ovals and sweeping intersecting curves, these swage lines even across the airbag in the centre. Let's do a quick horn test. Not as strident as I expected, it's semi-parpy. But yeah, we've got these intersecting semicircles for the speedo and the rev counter, semicircles for all the temperatures and batteries, and battery level, that's really unusual on a regular car. But if you're driving into the outback where there's no anything for 1,000 miles in either direction, you need to know your alternator's working, so that kind of stuff does actually count. Additionally, it's a massively hot country, so we have bonus extra air vents, double air vent there, air vent up there, air vents there. So yeah, very powerful air conditioning, I'm going to assume, is in this car. Starting at the top, we have got large T-shelf area. It's not very tall T-shelf, so only good for small tinnies and stubbies. So nothing for your big coffee cup is going to be successful up there, but lovely flat area, and it does tip away from the driver. So if you spill it on a bouncy road, it will run into the dashboard, not over your knees, which is a good selling point. And because Fairmont, we have got this wooden area here, the big wooden strip, giving it a touch of class with lots of controls for our air conditioning, temperature, HVAC, oval clock like in a Ford Ka, but not shared with the Ford Ka. And again, a bit of an American influence thing is the flatness, the slabbiness of this dashboard, because the original Fairmonts and Falcons were based on the American Falcon back in the early 60s. So their lineage does go all the way back there, but Australia being Australia, it is more of a European nation. Moving into the centre, we've got this big, very European New Age style curvy area. The radio would look at home in like a Mondeo from the late 90s, 2000 or so. And this little run of unusual buttons. The up-down button for the antenna, which is over on the front of the wing. That's not something you see very often. Your traction control button's got a big thing. And the F, because the lower spec models, the Falcons, did get their Falcon badge in the same font as back in the 1950s, incredibly. This car isn't automatic. It's a development of the Australian offshoot of Borg Warner, so it's kind of a Borg Warner-y feeling thing. We'll see what that feels like. It's got an economy button, which is well worn, but I don't know if it really does very much. Can't really see the fabric on the seats themselves because it has got seat covers on, which with a family and dogs and so forth, quite wise to do that to protect the seats until the children are out of spilling stuff age. An interesting thing here is the shape of this handbrake. It's a great big curvy, it's like I'm going to say boomerang, which is obviously playing to stereotypes, but yeah, the giant boomerang handbrake. Obviously being an automatic, slam it and park, never use it. Another well-used button here, fuel release down there. Also related to the fuel release is the engine. Let's have a look at that. Now there were basically two engine options in this car, the straight six Intech or the Windsor V8. Both were well, pretty old engines by the time they got to the turn of the century. The Windsor is the old Ford V8s from America, still in development, either in 4 or 5 litre V8. Those are the most powerful ones in the car. Or this thing, which is a development of the straight six going back to the Falcon back in the back in the 1960s. This had been massively worked over by this point. It is 4 litres, making 211 horsepower, 357 newton meters of torque. So it's got some fairly potent performance. And even being a heavy car, it'll still do 0 to 60 in about 7.9 seconds, which is fairly impressive. It's overhead cam, which they were making a big deal of at the time, which may not sound impressive, but considering the engine was 50 years old, that's not a bad development. It has variable length inlet manifold runners, and the gear and higher spec cars got variable valve timing as well, so making even more power. Now, climbing in the back of the car, we've got the same mad 90s geometric velour and velour on the armrests in the back as well, so fairly well appointed. Electric windows, although I'm guessing there was the option of maybe, could that be a manual window option, or is this just literally a screw cover? I don't know. Getting in is a little tight because this roof swoops down into such a tight little corner, so climbing in is a little tight on the bonds. Dip your noggin and climb in, and then, oh wow, these seats are so comfy. You just squish into them. They are absolutely lovely. And once you're inside though, once you pass this fairly low door frame, there's loads of headroom back here. These, like the Crown Victoria, were very popular taxis in Australia, and you can see why. Loads of legroom, loads of headroom. Got air conditioning vents here in the back as well, so your rear passengers are going to be comfortable. A huge, great parcel shelf for stuff. It's nice. It's a really nice place to be, frankly. Now this is the bit I've been looking forward to. Oh, there's the fan control. Oh, what's up here? Turn the fan down a touch. There we go. It is smooth. It's got a lovely straight six, that kind of grrr. Oh, it sounds like a straight six Ford. It sounds like a Granada, and that is creamy smooth from the off. As you know, I'm not a huge automatic gearbox fan. I may have mentioned this once or twice, but this is nice. This is relaxing. If you've got to drive 1,000 miles in a day, which is probably not that unheard of, across dirt roads with unmade surfaces, driving into the outback, this I can see working for you. Now, being right-hand drive, because Australians drive on the correct side of the road, this doesn't feel as hard to place on the road as the Crown Vic does, because obviously I'm on the correct side, and also the Crown Vic puts you right over to the side of the car. Quite unusually far. Oops, right-hand indicators, because Australians like that too. Now, as well as the exciting exterior design, it was a very modern car underneath as well. It became a stiffer shell than the previous generation. It was lighter, and it had a drag coefficient of just 0.029 CD, which was significantly better than before. So all those factors went in to give it about 10% better fuel economy than the outgoing 5th generation car. But because it was so avant-garde and out there in terms of styling, it never really sold as well as its main rival, the Holden Commodore. But that said, it goes a long way to show how well made the things were, because as of 2020, 38% of Australian national road stock was a Falcon AU of some derivative, astonishingly, which just goes to show how well they have lasted, bearing in mind the last ones were built in 2002. But really, it should have been well made, because they spent 700 million Australian dollars developing this thing and trying to get it right, or making sure they got it right, I should say, rather than trying, because in terms of fit and finish, noise, vibration, harshness, all that kind of thing, they really did get it bang on. Something I love about both of these is how they've been built to be unbreakably tough and long-lived, to keep on working year after year. Anyone can build a car that'll do 200 miles an hour with an unlimited budget, but to make a car that'll do 500,000 miles and still sell for 20 grand, that's impressive on both sides of the Pacific. There were 3 generations of this thing. The first one came out in 1998, the updated facelift version with just minor refinements, got a more normal, more traditional, if you like, grille on the front, because the first one was really quite out there. But that second generation only lasted less than a year before the Series 3 came out, although you'd be hard pushed to tell the difference between a Series 2 and a Series 3 in all honesty. But the Series 2 got a whole host of improvements, better dashboard, better radio and sound, better NVH, everything really. The seats are really comfortable, they're very supportive, they've got good lumbar, good headrest, everything is really nice, and they're lovely and squishy and foamy so you can just sink into them. And if you're on a long drive for many hours, you will be comfortable in the car. And then everything falls into place just really nicely. So all the controls are well within reach. Something the Crown Vic can't be accused of. And this car has got 310,000 kilometres on it, which is close to 200,000 miles, and it's not squeaking, it's not rattling, it's really interesting how well it's lasted. It shows how tough these things are. The biggest difference between these two is the body construction. The Vic is an old-fashioned separate chassis body-on-frame car, so it feels a bit like an old-school land yacht when you drive it. But with tighter and tougher cop-spec suspension, it does have a lot more stiffness than standard. This is a modern monocoque shell, so the car is much stiffer, and that means it rides and handles in a far more, well, European manner. The Panther platform uses coil springs and shocks all round, and it gets independent rear suspension. But the Fairmont doesn't get that until you reach gear spec. It was, however, the first generation of Falcon to get IRS as an option at all. You can tell it was designed to last and be treated really, really roughly. And that's the thing about the Australian market. The cars out there have to live a very, very hard life. If they import a European car without Australianising it, it's not going to last very long. Okay, let's give this a boot. Oh, proper old school automatic, kicks down, revs like crazy, then goes. This is very smooth, but I think the Crown Vic feels brisker. That has a more aggressive police spec shift map on it, and the V8 feels just a bit more urgent. This is all in kilometres per hour, so that's about 60 miles an hour there. That is one thing that will catch you out, is little subtle differences. Whereas the American car, everything is what we're used to, apart from being the driver sit on the wrong side. This is very European, apart from things like the kilometres per hour and the very old-fashioned gearbox. So in many ways, this does feel remarkably similar to the Crown Vic. The gearbox is slow and outdated. The engine is a continuation of a unit that had been around for absolutely years. And the suspension setup is not wildly different either. But this just feels so much more comfortable, so much more like a civilian, comfortable executive car that you could cruise a long time in. You could cruise forever in the Crown Vic as well, but this just feels like it's designed to be comfortable in, whereas the Crown Vic feels like it's designed to work. And the Crown Vic rattles. It really does rattle a lot. If ever you watch Bosch on Amazon, listen to the scenes where he's sitting in the car and you can hear the squeaks in the background all the time. Not just the engine and the gearbox noise, which you'll be recognising as well if you're sat in a Crown Vic. You'll definitely recognise the rattles. In this case, you just have that lovely, smooth, so creamy straight six, with that lovely edge of a growl that sixes always have. Well, the big question on Twitter was, of course, who would win in a drag race between these two cars? And honestly, having driven them both back to back now, without putting them side by side on the Santa Pod, I don't know. It would be a close run thing. They both have a very similar power delivery, but then, I don't know. I think the traction control on this car would let it down, as opposed to the locking diff on mine, which would give it an advantage. Honestly, if you closed your eyes in this car and didn't know what you were in, you would imagine you were in an 80s or 90s Granada. You really would. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed this little roundup of what it's like driving in the opposition's car. I've rather enjoyed this, well, actually a lot, seeing the differences between my car and Ian's car. And, well, it's interesting how, well, this car does feel so much more modern. Not massively surprising because, well, it was designed about 20 years later. But I have very much enjoyed the opportunity. Thank you, Ian, and thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have, please do hit like and subscribe. Join me again next time driving something completely different.